Veysey and Timmons Robert from SEI and Brown, respectively.
Thank you, Director Coit, and it's my pleasure to be here today. I want to express our gratitude, my gratitude for the time and your being able to present these findings. We hope that they are useful to the state in planning its energy and climate future, which we think is really important. I think my job, I'm going to hand this over to Jason, really the expert who ran the models, as fast as I can. My job is really just to sort of tell the origin story of this study, why it happened, why we did it, and then he'll carry it on from there. So the 2016 greenhouse gas reduction plan that the state had released, and then Allison was just talking about, and is updating the numbers from, was an excellent step forward, a huge step as required by the Resilient Rhode Island Act in 2014. But for me and for a number of others, it raised a lot of questions. The two most important ones for me were, what is the role of methane? We've learned a lot since earlier science about the role of natural gas, especially leak methane. When methane or natural gas is burned, it produces, of course, carbon dioxide. But when it leaks, the methane, or CH4, has an effect that's much, much greater on warming the planet. So we wanted to know if we updated some of those numbers with more current science and more realistic estimates of the leakage rates from our old pipes up here in New England from natural gas distribution, what would be the impact? And then the second thing was how much deeper could we go? Because that study in 2016 only looked at 80% emission reductions by 2050 as you saw the targets, which were actually targets based on science from around 1999 or 2001 when the Northeast governors and eastern provinces of Canada came up with that target of about 80% reductions by 2050. So Brown students, being Brown students, a few were talking to the Deputy Chief of Staff of the governor and saying, well, can you not go deeper? And there are other states that have now made 100% emission reduction plans. And her Deputy Chief of Staff at the time said the governor is willing to consider that deeper levels of reduction if somebody can show us that it's feasible. So those Brown students, being Brown students, came to me and said, you know, we've just heard this from the governor's staff. Shouldn't we help the governor see how it might be feasible? And so the three of us went to the president of Brown University and asked her for a big pile of money. And she said, no, I can't give you that, but I can give you this small pile of money. And the small pile of money allowed me to hire Jason Veysey and the Stockholm Environment Institute, who did the core modeling of the 2016 study. So it was, to me, a dream. It was like, wow, I can actually get the questions answered that I had back from those days. And I also allowed me to hire 4 students. 3 of them are here: Daniel Traver, Brett Kotler is not here, Ben Gross, do you guys want to stand up, and Angie Kim. So thank you all for the big help. So these are all my ways of thanking everybody. We presented this to the Science and Technology Advisory Board back in April, which maybe Jim Boyd can transmit. The response of the staff for the EC4 was positive on the methods and on the findings.
Yes, and we had after the review, we provided to you a series of not only questions but some recommendations for improvements in the report. And I want to tell you, I've gone through it, and it's fabulous. I love the 3 other section additions,
yes,
along with pathways forward and concrete recommendations, both for short-term as well as for long-term deep decarbonization. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that very much. And there was a series of other comments we received from interested experts and public at the time, and we did a ton of work on this, really. And I've been really pleased with how much effort and just brilliant knowledge about this issue that Jason was able to bring to this. Of course, the The news today, there's some bad news and some good news. I think there's really important good news we want to get to, but Jason will clarify some of what are the bad news part of it. It just means our mountain decline is somewhat higher, but the good news is that we can climb that mountain and there'll be great benefits from doing so. It's possible and it's feasible.
Okay, great.
And it's beneficial.
Thank you. So I'm Jason Veysey with Stockholm Environment Institute. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Director Coyne and members of EC4 for letting us present today. And we have some very interesting and I think exciting results to talk about. Just a word about Stockholm Environment Institute. I'm part of a global research institute that's headquartered in Stockholm, Sweden. But we have a U.S. center, which is a research affiliate of Tufts University. So that's where my office is, at Tufts. And my colleagues in the energy modeling program work principally there. So Timon's already described for you some of the objectives here, why we did what we did. We were looking to see if we could take the model that the state had used in 2016, update it, update some of the historical data, change some of the assumptions relative to methane leakage in particular and global warming potentials to better reflect the latest science, and then look to see if we could find deeper decarbonization pathways for Rhode Island targeting in the limit net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So we looked at a 2030 timeframe, a 2040 timeframe, and a 2050 timeframe. And we set ourselves a ground rule that we wanted to look at decarbonization using existing technologies. So we did not include more speculative technologies that often form the backbone of deep decarbonization pathways, particularly in the international context. And we wanted also to provide a first order estimate of costs of mitigation, which the state had taken some steps toward in 2016, but that work had not been finished, nor had it been published. So we decided that we would take it the rest of the way and provide an estimate of the direct costs of mitigation, direct social costs, not necessarily borne by the state, but the total cost to society of the mitigation programs that we looked at. Now I should say that they don't include, and I'll get to this a little bit more as I go through costs, they don't include estimates of all of the cost savings that would be realized by avoiding consequences of climate change. That's a very important thing to note here. This is a bit of our motivation. Why are we doing this? I mean, everybody here understands that climate change is real, it's happening, it's urgent. This is a snapshot from UN Environment's emissions gap report, which just looks at the gap in global emissions between the trajectory that we're on with the nationally determined contributions that countries have made under the Paris Agreement, and what would be needed to stay within 2 degrees average global warming or 1.5 degrees average global warming. We're not there even with all of the commitments that countries have made. There's a big gap that remains. The UN recently, or the IPCC recently released a report on that 1.5 degree trajectory. What would be needed to get on and stay on a 1.5 degree trajectory? And one of the things that they found was that by 2030 globally, carbon dioxide emissions need to decrease by about 60% globally. This is at the same time that countries like China, Southeast Asia, I mean, I work in developing countries principally actually, and I can tell you developing countries' emissions are going through the roof, which means that the lift is even greater for those of us in the industrialized countries who are primarily responsible for the problem, for the historical emissions. So there's an urgent need to act, and to act in a meaningful and substantial way. But at the same time, we recognize that there are many potential benefits of decarbonization here in Rhode Island, including not least reductions in the imports of fuels, with health benefits, local jobs and economic development benefits, and there are a number of these benefits that stakeholders in this room are well familiar with and that we also highlight in our report, and they're an important motivation for us here. And then fundamentally, we wanted to share these findings with the state in the hopes that they can help to inform the decisions that people are taking. This is just a little snapshot of the methods that we use. I said that we started with the model that the state had in 2016 that was developed using a piece of software that we make at SEI. It's called LEAP, the Long Range Energy Alternatives Planning System. It's a piece of software for analyzing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation strategies. We made a few changes in that model that are worth noting relative to what was done in 2016. So we updated some historical data. And we decided that we would update the natural gas leakage rate, which Timmons has alluded to already. And we looked at the literature to figure out what a reasonable estimate of natural gas leakage would be. Now in 2016, the rate of natural gas leakage that was used was based on the EPA's SIT tool and was effectively 0.66% of natural gas supplied was assumed to be leaked. But the evidence from the scientific literature is that the rate of leakage is likely much higher. It's probably north of 2%. We based our leakage rate in our study of 2.7% on a peer-reviewed study published based on measurements in the city of Boston, on the assumption that the infrastructure in Boston is similar to the infrastructure in the urban cores of Rhode Island, where a lot of the natural gas is used. So that's the methane leakage rate that we use. But we also updated the global warming potentials in our modeling to use the latest potentials from the IPCC. Those come from the 5th assessment report. And then we did two other things, two other major changes in the model. One was we took the modeling of the transportation sector, which had originally actually been based on moves, and we changed it around to an explicit stock model in our tool, using estimates of the evolution of vehicle stock from US EIA and Argonne National Laboratory. And that allowed us to have a very technology-rich model where we could explore what the implications would be of phasing out sales of certain technologies and ramping up sales of other technologies, and how those would cascade through the vehicle fleet over time. And then we made a choice about electricity supply as well. Now this differs from the approach that's taken now in the inventory, as we just heard, but we chose to look at production-based accounting of emissions from electricity supply. And all that means is that we counted toward the state's total emissions all of the emissions occurring within the state's borders. Now this is meaningful for electricity supply because it turns out that the electricity mix, the supply mix in Rhode Island, is relatively more carbon intensive than the mix in the ISO New England grid as a whole at the present time. And so this had an effect and intended to increase the emissions that we found. I would also point out that although there are some states that are using a consumption-based approach, production-based methodology is more consistent with most reporting protocols around the world, and it also reflects the ambit of the state's regulatory authority. The state can really only control emissions happening within its borders.
Jason, can I just a question for
Certainly.
what your modeling did on that? It's a new technology, it's a new industry. So did your modeling include, where did your modeling put in-state versus out-of-state for offshore wind? How did you determine what's in-state and what's out-of-state?
Yeah, actually, from an emissions perspective, it doesn't matter because wind is a zero carbon power source, so whether you locate it in-state or out of state is not going to affect the emissions that we calculate in the model, because the way that we do our accounting in the model, we actually have a full model of the ISO New England grid for dispatch and purposes of modeling how load is served. And so, so we calculate the dispatch of Rhode Island resources based on effectively how they would be dispatched in the ISO New England grid as a whole. And then we just count the emissions occurring within Rhode Island's borders as the emissions that we're reporting as part of state emissions. And so it doesn't really matter for our modeling whether we assume that the wind, offshore wind or any other wind is located in Rhode Island or out of Rhode Island. It will have the same impact on the ISO New England grid as a whole. It will affect the dispatch of resources in the same way, and therefore would affect the emissions that we calculate using this production-based approach in the same way.
Thanks.
Good question. So I'll just show you first a few baseline results, and then we'll take a look at some of our mitigation pathways. So this is a picture of the 2016 baseline in this orange color down here. And the baseline that we calculated with some of these changes that I just talked about. So the AR5 global warming potentials, production-based accounting, more realistic natural gas leakage rate. Now this is looking at 100-year global warming potentials. This means that we are considering the effect of the warming effect of greenhouse gases that are emitted today over the next 100 years. And what we found was about a 16% increase in current emissions versus what was calculated in the state's 2016 study. Now, I was listening very closely to the 2016 inventory report and tracking how we mapped to that inventory, and we're actually quite close. There were two big differences that I saw. I think we were at 12.1 million tons in 2016 versus the 11.0 that you just reported. There were two big differences. One was related to the other category, and I'm assuming that's probably attributable to natural gas leakage rates in your study. And the other was in the power sector, probably because of the production-based approach. But if you look at our report, you're going to see that we focused not on 100-year global warming potentials, but on 20-year global warming potentials. Because we know from the evidence in the emissions gap report and the 1.5 degree report from IPCC that the window to act on climate change is closing. We probably only have about 20 years to act if we want to ratchet down greenhouse gas emissions in the way that's necessary to assure that we avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. The 20-year potentials do that. They focus your attention on what the warming impact is going to be in this next critical 20-year period, and that's why we also chose to look at them and to report them in our study. And if you compare the 20-year potentials to the state's baseline from 2016, you find that emissions are 45% higher. Well, part of that's due to the fact that we estimated that there's actually more emissions in terms of mass, but also part of it is due to the changing to a 20-year focus, or 20-year horizon for the focus with the global warming potentials. Methane has a very high global warming potential in the short term, and over a 100-year integration, its global warming potential is less. The point of this is to say we need to look seriously at the emissions that we are producing now and what their effect is going to be in this next critical period. And that should inform the discussion about what the mitigation agenda should be. Here are the mitigation options that we looked at. And there probably aren't too many surprises in here, actually. What we did is we took many of the options that were in the 2016 report. We went further on as far as we could, and we also added a few things. So we had electric heating systems where we looked to convert heating in residential, commercial, and industrial buildings to heat pumps with resistive electric backup rather than a fossil fuel backup. Electric on-road vehicles for all classes of vehicles. Rail, low-carbon biofuels. In that case, we just inherited assumptions from the state's 2016 plan. Electric water heating with heat pump water heaters. Continuation of efficiency measures. An emphasis on industrial efficiency. We looked at potential for industrial efficiency in Rhode Island based on evidence from the U.S. Department of Energy's Industrial Assessment Centers program. And, of course, moving to a zero-carbon electricity grid as quickly as possible. As you said previously, that's a key element here if you're going to be electrifying end uses. You also have to have a clean electricity. We looked at natural gas leakage reduction from the gas distribution infrastructure. We made an estimate of what could be done there based on the trajectory that National Grid is following in their filings with the state. And we also assumed a modest sink from the forestry sector, the same sink that was assumed in the state's 2016 plan.
Jason?
Yes.
So, quick question. How do you define clean imports for the electric grid?
Yeah, how do we define clean imports? We define them as imports that are of electricity that's generated from zero carbon sources. So we actually have in our model for imports an implied emission factor associated with the import depending on the source of electricity and where it's coming from.
So explicitly, it either comes from New York or Quebec, right? And
New
if
Brunswick.
it's Quebec, it's largely, of course, hydro, right? If it's coming from New York,
Yeah.
it has fossil.
But actually, to be even more specific here, the clean imports here refer to the addition of 2.4 gigawatts of additional Quebec hydro onto the New England grid by the mid-2020s. So there are two projects that are being mooted right now, and they would provide 2.4 gigawatts to the entire New England area, and then Rhode Island would be able to utilize its share of that. So these are the results, some of the results that we found with our pathways, and what we found fundamentally is that it is possible to reduce emissions very quickly using these established technologies. So by 2030, you could make an important difference relative to the baseline. We were not able to get to net zero emissions completely. There were some residual emissions from the industrial sector in particular, some residual emissions from water transportation and air transportation. But we were able to get much of the way there with a 76% decrease in the long run from the most recent historical emissions, or an 82% decrease using those 100-year global warming potentials. Well, I want to emphasize that our modeling did not assume that there would be radical changes in economic structure here in Rhode Island. So we assumed that industry continues in Rhode Island, continues on the trajectory that it's been following. There's actually growth in industrial output. There's additional industrial efficiency that's engaged and some fuel switching, but there are still, at the end of the day, important emissions from industry, even in these decarbonization pathways. So one of the things that you could actually see in this slide here, and that it'll come out again on these subsequent slides where I show you some sector by sector results, is that the difference between the pathways is really a matter of how quickly you want to move. And for a lot of these measures that we've been talking about, to what extent you want to retire prematurely fossil fueled equipment. We know that vehicles stay on the road for as long as 30 years in the case of heavy duty vehicles. We know that heating systems have a lifetime of between 20 and 30 years depending on what sector we're talking about. We know that power plants have a lifetime potentially of 30 or 40 or 50 years depending on the technology. So if you want to cut your emissions quickly, well, the very first thing you need to do is you need to stop buying new fossil fueled equipment. And then the second thing you need to do is you need to figure out to what extent do we want to offer incentives to accelerate past the natural retirement rate for equipment. So you're going to see, this will come out on some of these subsequent slides, you'll see that in order to get on a steeper, faster decarbonization pathway like the 2030 pathway, some premature retirement of assets would be a requirement. Here's a little look at transportation. I've shown you our 2040 pathway in the middle here. All three of our pathways assumed that there would be no further sales of conventional fossil fuel vehicles starting in the 2020s. And there would be some accelerated retirement of those fossil fuel vehicles in the 2030 and 2040 pathway scenarios. We end up with some residual emissions out here from particularly off-road equipment, and water transport and air transportation.
Jason, you said we're basing this on things that were doable. If every person wanted to buy an EV in New England right now by 2020,
right.
would there be
Good question.
inventory?
So if we, the answer to that is, would there be inventory? Probably not. If all vehicle sales in New England as a whole moves to, there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem there. I don't know how many units manufacturers are actually planning on supplying in 2020, but there are already a number of electric vehicle options. And by the mid-2020s, it's conceivable that we could actually have most or all vehicle sales being electric. If you started just buying electrics today, you would still have some fossil fuel vehicles in the fleet for the next 30 years.
Medium? What kind of category?
Yeah, no, buses are both medium and heavy duty here, depending on the size of the bus.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Have you looked at if you were to, instead of fully electric, do hybrid buses that are electric and maybe CNG?
Yep.
And what, in terms of the price differential, is it more advantageous to do hybrid you can geofence to be fully electric in environmentally sensitive neighborhoods and have a bigger impact? Which we've been trying to figure out at a bus that's $895,000 versus a bus that's $650,000.
Right.
what's the differential here? Is it better for us to go all in, or do we look for a way to cherry pick the best
Yeah.
parts of each part of that?
My short answer to that is we haven't looked at that specific question, but our model is set up the way it would allow us to, because we have hybrid technologies in the model. For these pathways, what we said is we've got to get to zero as
Right.
quickly as we possibly can.
Right.
We
We just-
cannot have
right.
hybrid
Sure.
buses that are
Absolutely.
using natural gas, not in a world where we want to get to zero transportation emissions from buses. But that's a question that could be analyzed.
You
And
know,
my,
we look at what makes the bigger impact quicker.
right.
What do you have?
Given funding constraints.
Given funding constraints, right, that's right. So that's another way to approach this problem, because we have some cost estimates that come out of this, with the cost estimates for vehicles. You know the size of the fleet, right? So you can say, well, if we have X dollars to address a fleet with this many vehicles, and what's going to be the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions? And that's a question that we have not analyzed, but it is a question that would be possible to analyze with this. And we are going to be turning, right, and I'm happy to talk with you about that, but also this model, our intent is for this model to be made publicly available and to be conveyed to the state as well. Okay. This is a look at heating and cooling. So this is heating and cooling in residential, commercial, and industrial buildings all added together in this graph. And so we looked at the possibility for converting to heat pumps. If you need to heat and cool the same amount of space to the same degree, how many heat pumps would you need? What would it cost to do? How quickly could you phase them in? Again, the story is similar to in transportation. You've got to stop buying new fossil fuel systems. You have to, in the 2030 and 2040 scenarios, have some accelerated retirement of your legacy boilers and furnaces that use fossil fuels. And there is a little benefit here with the heat pumps. If you install them for heating, you can also retire some cooling-only systems that may not be as efficient as the new heat pump systems. Here are our results for electricity generation. So, right, so you can see that the results here are lumpy, reflecting the fact that our model has particular plants in it that are retired at particular times or brought online at particular times. The overall approach here was to stop building new fossil fuel plants. That includes the Burrelldale gas Clear River plant. We assumed that we could bring in 2.2, did I say 2.4? I erred, I think. It's actually 2.2 gigawatts of new hydropower from Quebec. That the Millstone 2 and 3 plants in Connecticut, nuclear plants, would be relicensed, which was an assumption that the state also made in its 2016 study, so we carried that forward. And then that there would be significant development of new solar PV and wind, particularly offshore wind. And as a result, you end up having to have some curtailment of that wind power over time, which costs some additional money.
Jason, your
Yeah.
baseline goes down to zero
Yeah.
in 2040. Tell me more about that.
Right, remember, these are emissions occurring within Rhode Island specifically. So the assumption is you stop licensing new gas plants, new fossil plants, the plants that you have eventually retire. Right.
Okay.
So even in the baseline, you get to effectively zero carbon if you're not going to be building new fossil fuel plants.
Jason, I'm sure you thought this through because your approach appears so thorough, but based on the heating and the transportation slides, the total electricity demand doubles, triples, quadruples.
Excellent.
Yeah, more than doubles.
So it affects the
Yeah.
retirements. Any renewables that you're adding in the decarbonization of electricity.
It affects the retirements how? I think I'm not sure I follow.
It increases the
It
demand.
increases the demand for electricity.
Correct, and the load, yeah.
So if you're adding additional renewables,
Right.
they may be added simply to meet the new demand and not actually displace existing fossil.
I see. Right.
Is that right, or have I got that?
So you could imagine that fossil plant owners would do everything possible in a world where electricity demand from going up substantially. Do everything possible to keep those plants online longer than is expected given their typical operational lifetime. In our modeling, we made the assumption that plants would retire after their expected operational lifetime. So there's a schedule for near-term retirements that's published by us in New England. We took that into account. And then for the longer term, we looked at the expected operational lifetime of plants based on their technology and assumed that they would retire after that lifetime. So part of the assumption here then is that there has to be a regulatory environment that is not allowing those fossil plants to be retrofitted and to continue in operation past the end of their operational lifetime. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a greater wedge in this chart here for natural gas or for coal or for other sources, other fossil sources.
But it seems to me that with a very substantial increase in offshore wind, coming in at prices that are going to be substantially lower than what can be delivered by fossil fuel plants out into the future, it's sort of self-defeating in that fossil fuel plants, even if they could have an extended lifetime, wouldn't be able to compete on a competitive basis with renewables.
This is potentially true, depending on what you assume about the cost of renewables. We know the costs per megawatt installed or per kilowatt installed are coming down. The levelized cost of electricity with wind and solar are decreasing. But there is also the issue of grid integration costs that need to be borne as you introduce a greater and greater percentage of variable renewable power into the grid. And that's something that we try to take into account in our modeling as well. So those integration costs include the need for transmission reinforcements, for additional storage, and for changes in the way that the grid is operated and resources are dispatched in order to account for the variability of wind and solar power. You'll see in the long run, we have a scenario that gets to about 60% wind and solar. So it's not 100% wind and solar scenario by a long shot, but even at that level, the integration costs are pretty high. We let the modeling here be controlled by the goal of getting to net zero emissions by 2030, 2040, or 2050. And we didn't simply choose the least cost solution, which might have included, given the grid integration costs, might still have included some fossil fuel power in the long run. So I think the answer to that is yes, if you just look at it on a, say, megawatt by megawatt basis, renewable power can be very cost competitive. When you consider the grid integration costs, it might not be the least cost solution relative to some types of fossil.
The question about nuclear, you said that you assumed a relicensing for Millstone. It
Yes.
looks like there might also be some additional nuclear in your assumptions, or did you have a?
No, there's no additional nuclear. No, what happens, looking at this little blip here?
Yeah, this was not sure that it was relicensing through 2050. That's what I was
Yeah,
trying
but this
to-
little blip here, is when one of the units goes offline for retrofitting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Teresa, one more question on imports. Because you're relying
Yes.
on the imported hydro,
Yeah.
under a production-based model, does that result in the shifting of CO2 and methane emissions from outside Rhode Island to the source of the power, despite the power being consumed
Yes.
for Rhode Island?
Yes. I mean, hydropower, this is Quebec hydropower principally. Hydropower is large hydropower, depending on how dams are constructed and where they're constructed, what the climate is and the temperature, it can have non-zero greenhouse gas emissions. If it happens, if you create a reservoir and you flood previously vegetated land, you end up with methane emissions. That stuff is effectively outsourced under the production-based approach. Yeah. I don't, let me see. I have Nick, after this meeting, I'd be happy to show you, and it's in our report as well. We have a graph looking at consumption-based versus production-based emissions in the electricity sector, because our model can run either way. And you do find that those consumption-based emissions do go up as a result of some of this outsourcing that you're talking about. Yeah. I don't have
Are you
any
troubled
slide.
by emissions from the new ponds in Quebec?
Compared to coal and natural gas and oil, no, I'm not. No, and my understanding of the literature on this is that those methane emissions from hydropower reservoirs are most concerning in tropical environments. So, I am more concerned about it. I do work with tropical countries where that's more of an issue.
You guys, because I want to make sure you get through
Yeah.
your slides, I'm going to ask people to just hold their questions about ponds and other matters until the end, so that we can make sure we get through the whole presentation.
Yes, and I will drop right along here. I only have a few more slides.
Okay, and then we can.
Okay, so this is a look at those direct mitigation costs. So they're discounted in 2019 at a 5% social discount rate. And what we're talking about here are capital and operating and maintenance costs for equipment used in the energy system, the cost of imported fuels. We are not counting climate damages that could be avoided by a program of mitigation. The main difference between these pathways is due to the accelerated retirement of fossil assets. If you retire assets early, it costs money. And that's reflected in these cost estimates. And you can see a peak here, for example, in the 2030 pathway around 2030 because of those accelerated retirements. And then the grid integration costs of renewables are also significant here. I want to emphasize that even though you see numbers that are in the billions here, this is not necessarily not be expected, but these would be costs that would be borne entirely by the state government. They would be borne in many cases by private investors who would be responding to new opportunities afforded by new programs and incentives to support the mitigation agenda. This is one of the features that we've added since we talked to staff about this study. What we did is we looked at no and low cost conservation and behavioral changes, steps that ordinary people can make to reduce their energy use, principally in the residential sector, some in the transportation and commercial sectors. And they're actually relatively simple things, like not doing a load of laundry until the washer is full, or reducing the amount of hot water you use through a low flow shower head. What we found was that these measures can actually have a really significant impact on total mitigation costs. Cumulative costs could drop by as much as 13% here you see in the 2040 pathway. These are the exact same scenarios in terms of the emission reductions that they achieve, but the costs are much lower in the case where we are doing public education to encourage people to take steps toward efficiency. Here are the key findings that I'd like to highlight here for you. We know that the challenge is significant. In our opinion, previous assessments have probably underestimated Rhode Island's actual GHG emissions. We need to act quickly. It's possible with existing technologies to achieve 70 to 80% reductions in the near term. You have to think about how quickly you want to do that, in part as a function of to what degree you want to retire assets prematurely. We've talked about the key strategies that we've used. They're similar to strategies that are used in the 2016 report and in other decarbonization analyses, including electrification and efficiency, low carbon electricity, and for us, reduced methane leakage was a key mitigation option that we looked at as well. We have to stop buying new fossil fuel equipment, and we do think that making modest changes in behavior, and we really have only scratched the surface here, making modest changes in behavior seems to me to be a gain. It's something that we really should do to reduce mitigation costs, and we should consider possibly deeper changes as well. And if we're serious about avoiding dangerous climate change, that in our judgment, the 2030 pathway is most defensible. Now, in our report, we've proposed this list of enabling actions, which actually map quite well to the slide that we saw earlier. I'd just like to highlight two of them here for you. One is that if we want to move to low carbon heating, low carbon transportation, then we probably need to set a phase out date for sales of new equipment. And in our pathways analysis, those phase out dates came in the early 2020s. So it's not something that you can defer and kick down the road. The other thing is with respect to natural gas. So we found that natural gas, if you have a leakage rate that seems to be better supported by the science, natural gas has an outsized impact on emissions here in Rhode Island. It means that you need to plan for we're getting off of natural gas as soon as possible and have a plan for decommissioning that gas infrastructure, which will continue to leak if it's kept pressurized, even if you're not necessarily using a lot of gas from the pipelines. So a couple of things to think about and highlight here. And I will stop there.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to make sure, I think we should, we've got 10 minutes more, but I want to make sure that we have time for some questions and discussion. Mike?
So you've got a 2030 date, give or take, for removal of a lot of the carbon consumption. When, I think I already know the answer, and we're probably too late in starting, but if we're going to move to an electric regime of zero emission generation for electricity, you talk about storage, but what you haven't talked about is transmission. And it seems as though you're putting a lot more into the transmission system that it probably isn't designed to handle today. And have you looked at all of what the cost of upgrading the transmission system is and how long that will take so that you can realistically get to 2030 and be able to do what you propose?
Yeah, so our estimate of grid integration costs did include an amount for transmission. We didn't do a specific study where we looked at where plants would be sited and exactly what new transmission lines would be built, but we took an average cost for transmission reinforcements and transmission extensions and put that into the grid integration cost. So those are part of those cost numbers that you saw. And I would say that you're right. I mean, we're at least going to have to extend the transmission system to new renewables facilities. If we build offshore wind, for example, we have to extend out to the offshore. And if the region, if ISO New England decides that it's going to import more of its renewable power from, say, wind farms in the Midwest or solar farms elsewhere in the country, then you need to have transmission reinforcements outside of the ISO New England area as well. So we accounted for that in a broad brush way with our grid integration costs, and we tried to capture it there, but we did not look specifically at what transmission segments would need to be added to enable particular plants.
I'm thinking even broader than just transmission to getting to end users. So if we're going to get out of fossil fuels for residential heating, do we have a transmission network that can handle that capacity to charge electric vehicles and electrify homes to 100%, given the electric transmission wiring that exists in the state today? Or do we need to start, in essence, overbuilding for demand today to where it potentially could be in another 10 years?
Yeah, that's
and,
a good
and that cost.
Yeah, I think that's a part of question about the distribution system.
Yeah, but it's more.
And in part a question about transmission within the state.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And my intuition is that, yes, you're right, you would need to do that. We have not looked at that. We didn't look at that specifically, though. We didn't look specifically at, like I said, transmission reinforcements that would need to be made in particular segments of the grid. And we didn't look specifically at the question of the distribution system, or whether the distribution system in particular parts of the state would be sufficient to handle the expected load. Would be an interesting thing to take a look at as well.
Jason, thank you very much. And Mike, a lot of those questions are looked at by the Public Utilities Commission, the OER, and ourselves, the division, in relatively granular terms. On methane, really excited to see that work. We have an infrastructure safety and reliability program. In the last couple of years, we've doubled pipeline replacement from 30 miles to 60 miles a year, and are now using, sort of with National Grid, sort of ranking protocol to identify the types of pipe that are most prone to leak.
Yes.
On cost, that slide, we'd be eager to talk more with you to distinguish between O&M and capital costs.
Yes, so we can break that down.
To make costs accessible to us, the way they're treated, passed on to ratepayers. It's really different with their capital costs and O&M, and having just a single aggregate number isn't quite as meaningful.
Yeah. I don't know that we, Timmons, you might remember. I'm not sure if we presented a greater disaggregation study, but we certainly have that.
Happy to follow up afterwards.
Analysis.
And then I guess the biggest question that I have, which is one that it's really a question that I certainly don't know, but from a climate science perspective, does the Earth care about the 20-year planning time horizon that we as policymakers have to achieve targets to set climate change? Or does the Earth's natural cycles respond on a longer time frame such that whether the methane is still at its most potent, whether we should be looking at that 100-year, is that something that matters as far as the way we're experiencing climate impacts? And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just don't understand that as a climate science.
You look like you might want to chime in here.
You know, I'd like to just finish some questions here, and then during the public comment period, we can have more questions for you.
Sure.
Do you want to respond to
Right,
that?
so very briefly, I'm not a climate scientist. My understanding is that the climate system has both shorter term and longer term responses. And so the 20-year potential, the short term warming impact is important for some types of climate responses. And there's also a longer term component that's important. As to the specifics there, I'd have to defer to the climate scientists.
Jason, I have a question, and I can't remember if it was in the report. So the Trump administration, through their DOT and NHTSA, are about to undermine the CAFE standards, and that is part of a preemption clause in the Clean Air Act that allows Rhode Island, like California, to achieve some of our greenhouse gas goals. That change will eliminate about 50% of reductions we're expecting from our fleet. Are you anticipating that the Obama CAFE standards would go into effect, or are you?
In the baseline
Yeah,
scenario?
exactly.
Because in our mitigation scenarios, we're no longer burning gasoline and diesel, but in the baseline scenario, yes, the assumption, so fundamentally that modeling there is based on the vision model from Argonne National Laboratory, which is assuming an increase in efficiency over time in the conventional vehicle fleet, and I'm pretty sure it's assuming that the Obama era CAFE standards remain in effect. Because if you look at the baseline scenario for, I don't have a slide in here, but we have something like this in our
Yeah.
report, but if you look at the baseline scenario for transportation, you'll see that transportation emissions come down over time. That's just attributable to greater efficiency.
Right.
Because even though vehicle miles traveled are increasing,
Greater
efficiency is increasing.
Yeah, and I know, this is tremendously valuable. I have some more questions, and maybe we can set up another meeting or conference call or something where we can further discuss
Sure.
some of these, in particular, in light of some of what also you saw in the inventory and what we're seeing, some of the questions that we have.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating to see. the
Yeah, it
results.
was good juxtaposition, and I think, this certainly just lends more urgency, and to a point Tim made at the beginning, we know a lot more now than we did when we made the 2016 report. The science has improved, our sense of urgency about acting sooner, and doing more in the near term, and how important that is only heightened by your report and what we're learning. So I want to make sure we get through, which I think is going to be very quick, some other agenda, and then during the public comment period, we could have people ask some more questions. Julie, did you
Just
have a-
one quick comment, because I think this setting is hard to have the really detailed
Yeah.
conversations about, when we're talking about the transmission, a lot of the details that get into the economics and the reality of what all of our agencies and our communities face around what is feasible, or how do we get over some of those barriers. And so I would encourage and be excited to be able to have more detailed sector-based conversations around how we see it, less so on the policy side, because those conversations are happening already, but like within communities, how do our agencies support some of the individual-based decision-making and choices that would have to change, whether it's in people's homes or what cars they buy.
Right.
Because that all adds up to
And
that pie, those big pieces of the pie.
I would also go back to something Carol said earlier about the carbon pricing study that you're about to undertake. My understanding is that is going to have a significant component that looks at distributional questions. And so it'll be very interesting to see how that can link an analysis of carbon pricing to distributional issues to the realization of technical pathways like we're talking about here. To see who bears the cost, how will it be borne, and at what time.
And you said at the outset in your report, right, that basically you're not counting on innovation, you're basing this on what's possible now.
Yeah, that's right. And we're basing this on what's possible now or what's projected to become possible in the next 10 years or so, using estimates from the US government, where we're not looking, we explicitly excluded technologies like large-scale carbon capture and storage, which has not really been demonstrated at scale yet, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which a lot of people use in modeling scenarios to attain negative emissions over time. We exclude things like that.
Thank you. So stay there, because I think we'll probably
Okay.
have some more questions and comments.